Chapter 7. Play area in our neighborhood was limited in spite of the fact that the houses were built far apart. The terrain was steep with an abundance of wooded areas, and there were a number of places we were not supposed to play. Papa had a vegetable garden, Mrs. McNabb had flowers, the chicken house had lice, Mrs. Fowler didn't like dirty children playing with clean little Steve, and in the woods somewhere was a scary old well. Mrs. Williams had warned Mama that the well would be a dreadful place to fall into. This was especially fearful for me, because according to Papa, I was accident-prone. That meant I fell into things. If anybody is going to fall into anything, Papa would say, it'll be Franny. Neighborhood boys told us fearful stories about the well that left us shaking like the maple trees nearby. There's a huge prehistoric monster who lives there, Duncan told us one evening while we were sitting on our back steps. He's 100 years old. Port was scratching mud off of his tennis shoes. He claimed he had just come from visiting the monster. Yeah, he fell in when he was just a germ and couldn't get out. Yeah, but he just kept drinking water and eating snails until he grew up. But by that time his stomach was too big, so he's trapped forever. But guess what? He still can get his head out of the hole, and he snaps at anything that gets near. Don't you hear him at night? Port let out a howl. He waits till everybody's lights are out, and then he begins. Dunny howled too. When I stopped to think about it, I had heard him howling at night. Flora said it was the wind around the eaves, but now I knew better. It was the monster. I, for one, never wanted to go up near the well, or any place else for that matter. I just wanted to stay on the front porch riding the kiddie car. Mama said we were getting too big for kiddie cars, and began urging Papa to make us a playground. Papa agreed, but it always took an emotional crisis to get Papa into gear. Fortunately, he was approaching an emotional crisis. It involved the gang of older boys from Holly Street that hung around under our streetlight, yelling and laughing far into the night. All the neighbors agreed. Boys that hang around under streetlights are bound to get into trouble. One morning at the breakfast table when Papa was unrolling his napkin, he posed the question, why don't people keep their kids at home so they're not out keeping other people awake? When Mama failed to come up with the answer, which she often did in such circumstances, he provided his own. It's the boy problem. Kids in the city don't have enough to do. It's a different world than living on a farm where you've got a couple hours hard work before you head off to school and when you come home. Hard work is good for you. It gets your blood moving. Papa paused. Mama was at the table pouring coffee into Papa's cup from the old aluminum percolator. She had bought a new one to go with her new electric stove, but Papa claimed that the coffee tasted new. So she had simply gone back to the old. Papa had a routine with his coffee. He poured it from his cup into his saucer, then blew on it until it was cool enough to sip. Why doesn't Mama pour the coffee right into your saucer? I asked. Papa gave it a thought before answering. Because it would be labor-intensive. That means your mother would have to trot from the stove to the table 10 times during breakfast, carrying the steaming pot of coffee, and then... I had one point he might not have considered. It would get Mama's blood moving. Papa laughed and I felt good. But then he went on about the boy problem. Without the chores to do, boys have too much time to just sit around and think. And what is there to think about? The world is full of experts doing just that. Without proper supervision, boys are left to follow their own natural instincts. Papa paused to take another sip from his saucer. Hell, with all the modern inventions, there's not even any outhouses for them to overturn. We're eating, Roy. Mama was standing at the table with the pot of oatmeal mush and the long-handled wooden spoon. And while we're on the subject of chores, Papa said, Franny, take the pressure off your tailbone and see if you can find the sugar bowl. I groaned. It was hard getting the blood moving. Papa remarked with annoyance, and now I will tell you about the girl problem. Fortunately, he didn't. He ate his mush, removed his napkin, which he wore like a bib, banged the table with his fist, and announced, By God, my kids are going to have a place to play. The next day, a truck delivered sacks of cement, a pile of sand, a stack of lumber, and a huge metal roller. It was a wonderful warm day. The cherry tree was in bloom, and the air smelled faintly of the brown house at the top of the hill. I sat on the lumber and watched Papa pushing the roller around the area where he had had his vegetable garden. That afternoon, Papa got out his tools. As was his rule, when Papa was creating something, he didn't announce his objectives in advance. He'd say, Let me get along a little ways and we'll see what we come up with. What we came up with was a swing, a teeter-totter, a sandbox, and a baseball diamond. Everything was close to the large double door that led into the basement. It was wonderful for Mama. All the hours that she spent washing and ironing, she could keep an eye on us. Unfortunately, the whole area was in plain view of Mrs. McNabb's kitchen window, and she felt it was her responsibility to phone Mama and report any activity that she considered to be a little out of the ordinary. "Florence is bouncing Frances on the teeter-totter," Mama complained to Papa. "I spend so much time running upstairs to answer the phone, I don't have any time to watch the children." Papa said, "When I make my first $1,000,000, I'll install an elevator." Everything about the playground was substantial and big, except the baseball diamond. It was small. That didn't bother us at first because our contacts with the ball were feeble. As our batting averages improved, however, our troubles increased. A pop fly could go into the McNabb's windows, a home run could go into our windows, a hit to the right could go into the blackberries, and a hit to the left could go into the old chicken house. A foul ball, Dunny informed us. That seemed logical. It wasn't until years later that I realized that a ball didn't necessarily have to go into a chicken house to be defined as a foul ball. Before long, the Holly Street gang discovered our playground, and when Papa wasn't around, they charged in and took possession. They would throw speedballs, sling bats, skid into bases, and hit foul balls while we girls stood by, intimidated. Florence squared her shoulders and explained Papa's rules. Unfortunately, the big boys completely disregarded Papa's rules, until one day when Papa came home unexpectedly and explained the rules a good deal more clearly than Flor had. I was amazed at how promptly the diamond cleared. The neighborhood boys weren't much better behaved than the Holly Street gang, except, being smaller, they couldn't knock the balls as far. Mama suggested that Papa try being more kind and patient, but Papa was no good at that. He simply banned all boys from the baseball diamond. We objected, because with the exception of Catherine, all the other children in the neighborhood were boys. It didn't give us many basemen. During the ban, Robbie found a way of being involved. He'd lean out his bedroom window, which overlooked the playground, and imitate a ballpark announcer. "And now we have the mighty Dorothy Bigham at the plate. She has had 8 home runs the last 9 times at bat." Little Dor could hardly pick up a bat. "Here comes the pitch." Dor swung real hard. "Strike 1. Here comes the second pitch. Strike 2. Here comes the third pitch. Strike 3. Here comes the fourth pitch." Because Dor was always breaking up the game with her tantrums, Papa made a new rule. "Dor gets to swing until she gets a hit." Robbie said, "Kill the umpire." In the meantime, the Holly Street gang had begun holding club meetings in the old chicken house, and it began to appear as though Papa had taken Mama's advice on being kind and patient. Papa didn't even try to chase them out. With all the kindness going on, it seemed that all was well in the neighborhood, until one evening when Papa got a phone call. When he hung up, he was smiling broadly. Mama said, "What was it?" It was the mother of one of the Holly Street boys. She wanted to inform me that her son would never be allowed to come to our place again. The boys claimed that I gave them permission to hold their meetings in the old chicken house. Mama's next question was fairly obvious. "Did you?" Papa looked innocent. "You know, my dear, I wouldn't do that. It's not on our property." Mama put it all together. "You mean they got lice?" "A bad case. They all had to have their heads shaved." This scared Flor and me. It was bad enough that we had to have Papa's boyish bobs, but we'd die if we had to have our heads shaved completely. We vowed that we would never go in the old chicken house, although we discussed it often. "Did you ever see a lice?" I asked Flor. "Of course not, dummy. Lice are too little to see." "Are they littler than flues?" "What are flues?" "Isn't that what we wore our flu masks for? So that we wouldn't catch the flues?" It was shortly after we had started spending time in the McNabb's yard that Mama made a discovery. The whole episode was really quite simple, but I got blown out of proportion, like simple things often do. One night when Flor and I were in the bathtub, Mama discovered that both of us had red wrists. Mama began to question us. I began to explain, but Flor put a soapy hand over my mouth and said, "It's nothing." I figured that was her way of saying, "Shut up." But I was puzzled. Flor had been a great one for snitching, especially on the boys, but in this case, she told me, "If we tell Mama everything, she'll never let us go out the back door." As the days went by, the red wrists continued. Mama began to suspect the boys. "Do they take you into the woods? Do they tie you up, do they?" We were indignant. "Of course not." Mama discussed it with Papa, and he said, "You'd better keep your eyes on them when they're outside." Mama was indignant. "I do my best." Now with baseball no more fun, Flora and I started going to the McNabb's high rockery that overlooked Seward Park Avenue, where the neighborhood kids gathered to watch the cars go by. Mama was not happy about the situation. She feared a confrontation with Mrs. McNabb. She warned us not to pick anything, or sit on anything. I wasn't too happy about the situation either, except for the fact that a large maple tree shaded the area, so it was cool in the summer. I had never thought much about automobiles, in spite of the fact that we spent far more time traveling in cars than any of the other neighbors. To me, one looked just like any other. So what was there to talk about? However, the boys found lots to talk about and always kept a lookout for unusual cars or new models. One day, a car went by that Duncan called a closed car. He pointed out that it had real glass windows all around, not isinglass windows like the cars we were used to. "But you wouldn't catch me riding in one," Duncan said. "If you got in an accident, you'd get your head cut off." We'd heard Papa and Max saying the same thing. On another day, a car went by that caused great excitement. Dunny announced that it was a Model A Ford, a revolution in the Ford motor car industry. This prompted a game called I Spy. I wasn't interested in playing the game, but by the very nature of the game, I was involved whether I wanted to be or not. Flora and I hated the game, and we were poor at spotting the Model A's. One day, however, Flora and I spotted something that was far superior to any car. We were alone on the rockery when we heard what sounded like a loud clap of thunder. But it couldn't be. It was a sunny day. It just kept getting louder. We reasoned it must be a very big truck engine. We looked up and down the avenue but saw nothing. The noise became deafening, and suddenly, there was this thing in the sky. The boys came running, waving furiously. We watched in amazement as the thing descended toward the lake, hit the surface of the water, skimmed down the lake, and shortly took off again and headed back over us. "An airplane!" we shouted. "A hydroplane," the boys corrected us. We were annoyed. We considered that the boys might be experts on cars, but we Bigham girls were certainly the experts on airplanes. We were the daughters of the one person in our neighborhood, or maybe even the whole Seward Park area, who had been in an airplane. And a harrowing experience it had been. Even before Papa's harrowing experience, he had told us about the airplanes that were manufactured at the Boeing plant just over the hill. "Yes, sir," he'd begin the inevitable history lesson. "It was just a couple of years before we moved to Seattle that Bill Boeing, the son of a wealthy Midwest timberman, took a ride in a hydroplane on Lake Washington. Must have been a pretty bumpy ride, because old Bill figured he could build a better plane. Well, sir, just about the time that Franny was born." "In Aloha," I would remind him. "In 1917, Flora the Brain said, that he and another fellow built their first plane, a two-winged seaplane in a building on the Duwamish River, just over the hill from us, which they called the Red Barn. Then they started to build warplanes. But the war got over," the Brain said, "and we moved to Seattle." So Bill began building mailplanes. We all understood that Papa had now come to the era of which he was the real expert, and he didn't always repeat the story of his harrowing experience because we had heard it a dozen times. Dunny and Port, still excited about the occasion, had continued the conversation. "That was probably Bill Boeing himself. Even though he's got lots of money, he still likes to take rides and test his planes himself. Of course, he has to pay other guys $1 an hour to do it," Port said. Flora finally found her voice. "Wouldn't that be fun to ride in one of those?" Portis squelched our hopes. "They'll never let girls ride in 'em. Girls don't know nothing about machines." "Girls couldn't even turn the propeller to start the engine," Dunny said. "They wouldn't know how to steer." "Someday they'll make planes big enough to fly clean across the ocean," Dunny speculated. "But they'll never let girls ride in 'em," Port said. "It's a wonder even that they let them ride in cars." "But you can betcha they'll never let girls drive 'em," Port said. How dumb. We knew that.